In this lecture on the productification study, I will focus on our research method and the questionnaire that we have created to collect the necessary information. The ideal way to measure the share of productive work in the economy would be to build upon established measures, established macroeconomic measures such as the gross domestic product or the gross national product. So if we could do this, measure the output and the value added of project work, we would be able to directly compare it to the total GVA and GDP. And that would be the optimum way to do it. But the reality is not so simple. There are major challenges in practice to use this method. To begin with, the projects are very different from one to another. The results of the projects are very different. For instance, we can talk about a project that delivers a product or a service with a market price, and that is completely different from a project that has to do with new product development or changes in an organization. So the variance of product types leads to a variance of product results. Secondly, all projects directly or indirectly influence the value of an organization, but it is difficult to specify the monetary value of, for instance, a change project, internal change project. And this is due to a variety of factors: unclear time horizon in which the change project is delivering its results, and also the extent to which the change was indeed achieved. So the monetary values are not captured in the organizations or they cannot be allocated. And finally, the revenues directly attributed to projects, they must be recorded to obtain an output-oriented measure of productive work. But this is not possible in reality. This data is only to some extent available for projects which lead directly to revenues. But what about internal projects, such as the change projects? They would be ignored, as well as most projects in the public sector. And therefore, any measurement based on project output seems to be very difficult. So we see that even project-oriented companies, they are not showing the project-related expenditures or the returns in their accounting systems. So we have come up with a different solution to assess the productification. So let's imagine that we have the organization we are dealing with in the black circle. We can assess and maintain overview of all the work that is being performed in the organization. That is all the man hours of every employee in the organization. And I indicate this with the blue dots in the picture. So if we define the concept project, we will be able to assess the number of work hours in the same organization that fall under the definition of a project. And in this picture, I have indicated this with by changing some of the blue dots to red dots. So the share of the project work to total work then simply becomes this ratio. We have counted all the work in the company and all the project work, and we simply divide the project work with all the work. So this is the simple representation of the method that we developed to assess productification in terms of an organization. So looking at the research process that was applied in whole, it started with an exploratory study in the beginning stages to create this method of assessing the productification, developing the concept, and do a qualitative pre-study. And this is what we might call exploration. And then we applied this tool in Germany with a quantitative large-scale survey, and then followed by data analysis. And then we repeated the process in Norway, adopted the tool to Norway, and accumulated the data. And finally, we did the same exploration in Iceland with adapting the tool and then collecting data and analyzing the data. And in the end, we wrote a report on the whole research project. A key definition in this research project is the way in which we define a project. And here we followed international standard, and we say that a project is an undertaking largely characterized by the uniqueness of the conditions in their entirety. So this is quite typical. We assume that there is a specific target that has been defined for the project. So we have a specific goal in mind. The project is supposed to deliver some specific outcome. The project is limited in terms of time. So it has a defined beginning and defined end. And we say that the project requires some specific resources. This could be financial resources, it could be staff, etc. We say that there is an independent project organization, and this organization is different from the standard organization of the company. For instance, there is a project manager, and he has a team of people, and he reports to a sponsor or a steering group, etc. A project is not about doing the same thing again and again and again and again. So the projects work on a non-routine tasks. We say that a project has a minimum duration of 4 weeks. So if it's less than 4 weeks, it falls outside this definition. And finally, it needs to have at least 3 participants. So you can see that this definition of a project is, some would say, conservative. For instance, projects with less than 3 participants would fall outside this definition. But when we go to the organizations and ask them questions about the share of project work in the organization, this is how we define a project. This is the criteria we ask them to use when they assess the share of project work in their organizations. So this is our concept for measuring the projectification. In terms of an organization, we ask representatives of organizations to assess the share of project work on the total work in the organization. The organizations are representatives of business sectors. We apply a system called NACE, which is the statistical classification of economic activities in the European community. So by collecting data from large enough number of organizations from each sector, we can calculate the mean values for that sector. And all in all, that leads us to conclusions regarding the economy in whole. And we can calculate the projectification, that is the share of project work to the total work in the organizations, in the sectors, and the economy in whole. And we can look at the figures for the different sectors as we indicate in this table. You can see 10 sectors in the table, and in spite of the industrial structural differences between Iceland and Germany, we use the same 10 industrial sectors in both countries. The data collection process applied is stratified random sample. So this table shows the situation in Germany. In Germany, they decided to collect information from 500 companies. And they decided that half of them would be collected from companies up to 250 people and half in larger companies, more than 250 employees. Furthermore, it was decided that there would be 100 answers from production industry, 70 answers from finance and insurance services, 100 from public administration, and so on. So all of this was decided beforehand. So in Germany, a professional research company was hired to collect the data. A list of questions was sent out to the respondents, and that was followed by email and then telephone interviews to collect the data. And for instance, for production industry, if a particular company in the random sample did not reply, then they chose another company from the same list randomly. So in the end, they had the total number of answers that they sought from the beginning, that is 500 answers in Germany. In Iceland, we had a different number. We had 142 companies in Iceland. If you look at this table showing the results for Iceland, you will see that some of the figures, they look kind of strange. And this is because, in order to simplify the study, 4 sectors were in fact excluded from the survey. But the impact or the productification was beforehand estimated by experts, by economists and by expert panels. This was done in Germany, and in Iceland we had the same process. We had another expert panel that reviewed the data and discussed these assumptions and came to the conclusion to use the same assumptions as in Germany. As a consequence, no data was in fact collected for Sector A, which is agriculture, forestry and fishing, for Sector F, which is construction, for Sector L, real estate, and for Sectors M and N, corporate service providers. So we simply assume that the productification in agriculture and forestry and fishing is 4%. For real estate, it is 2%. For construction, it is 80%. And for corporate service providers, it's 60%. These are assumptions that we have made, and we can justify them, and that is what we have done. But we would very much like to put these numbers to the test and go out and collect the data and find out if these assumptions are in fact accurate. For instance, in Iceland, in the fishing industry, which is a dominating industry in Iceland, do we really believe that the share of project work is not more than 4% in that industry? This is what we would like to know. So, referring to the research process that we showed you earlier, we have decided to add yet another step in the research, and that is to do a quantitative survey on the 4 sectors that I just talked about. In order to explain to you in simple terms how we intend to do this, I will draw a simple figure demonstrating organizations in category A. And you may remember that A is agriculture, forestry, and fishing. And we will assume that in Iceland, fishing is absolutely dominating in that category. So we will focus on fishing companies. So let's assume that we have a database of all the fishing companies in Iceland. And they are represented in this figure as the blue lines. Obviously, we don't have the resources to go and ask all these organizations. And we don't need to contact all of them. What we can do is to choose a stratified random sample from this database. And in our particular case, we have decided that we will go and collect data from 12 of the companies in this list. There will be 4 groups of students working on this, and in each group there will be 2 students. So you can see that each group is then supposed to collect information from 3 organizations in the list. So how will this happen? Well, it's not very complicated. From this total list of all of the companies, we will randomly choose the 12 organizations, and they will be divided between the 4 groups. So each group is talking to 3 companies, as I said before. If some company, for one or another reason, will not participate, then we will simply randomly choose another company from the list. So in the end, we will have 12 answers from this list of companies in the fishing sector in Iceland. So finally, let's talk about the questionnaire that you're supposed to use when you approach the organizations. The questionnaire is made available to you as a PDF document, and it's good to read that document carefully before you start collecting the data. First, we have some general information about the background and the objective of the questionnaire, the duration of the survey, and we say here that the estimated time to answer is 15 minutes. In reality, it may be longer because it is possible that the person that you talk to will need some time to collect the information, and you may need to contact the person again after he has or she has processed and provided the necessary information. So this figure, 15 minutes, is maybe not very accurate. We have a text on confidentiality and data protection. And then in the end, we promise that if people want, we will provide an exclusive report on the results. The actual survey consists of 3 sections, A, B, and C. So the first one is a general section on the industry and the size of the company. We are using the NACE classification system to place the company in the appropriate category. And we ask also about the size of the company in terms of a number of employees. How many employees are working for your company? In B, we are starting to ask about the project activity in the organization. We define a project as we explained before, and we explain to the participant that in the following questions, we ask them to assess the project landscape in the entire company, not for a particular department, but for the entire company. So people are asked not to refer to individual areas, for instance, not a particular department, but use the whole organization as a reference. So they are asked to which extent are the following project types being applied in your company. And we ask about internal projects, organizational or human resource, IT, research and development, marketing, infrastructure. And finally, we ask about external projects that are done for an external customer. And people can choose from this table in the range of no application at all to very frequent application. We ask what is the average extent of the projects in the company in terms of number of employees and the project budget. So we ask about the average number of employees per project and the million euros of project budget on average. We ask about the average duration of the projects in number of months. We ask if there is any central project organization in the company. And then we start to ask about the value of the project work. We ask what is the share of projects or project work in percent in the company, how big this share was 5 years ago and how big it is estimated to be in 5 years from now. So firstly, the state as today, and the point of reference is to be 2017. The state as it was 5 years ago, and finally the state in the future 5 years from now. So we are talking here about the share of project work in comparison to the total amount of working hours of all employees. We tried to estimate the following project-related expenses in comparison to the total expenditure of the company, both for internal personal expenses for projects in comparison to the total personal cost, and then the external personal expenses in comparison to the total personal cost. In question 10, we are asking about the size of the share of the turnover of the organization achieved through external projects as compared to the total turnover of the company. We ask generally about project success, and we ask people to assess how many projects over the totality of projects achieve their goals in terms of time, cost, quality, satisfaction, or in total. We ask about the overall performance of the company, how it came off in the past 3 years in comparison to the average in the industry in terms of customer satisfaction, EBIT, profit margin, etc. So this is of course very subjective, so this has to do with the perception of the respondent. We talk about the innovative success. These are questions about innovation as an activity in the organization. We ask them to assess the average success of the innovations, novel product and solution approaches of the past 3 years in comparison to the main competitors in the industry. And finally, in section C, we ask for some general information on the company and the people that are answering the survey. Ask about the field or department, the position within the company, the age of the company, We ask about the share of expenses for innovation in the company, and then we have some general questions about the turnover of the company.